The year was 1862. The American Civil War was tearing towns apart, but in the deep folds of Appalachia, there were no marching armies, no flags waving in the fields, only silence and the endless shadow of the mountains. Within one of those hollers, a single lantern flickered inside a crooked log cabin. That night, a midwife was summoned. She had delivered dozens of children before, but nothing could prepare her for what she was about to witness. When she arrived, the father met her at the door. He was a gaunt man with sunken eyes, a man neighbors whispered had grown strange in his obsession with blood purity. He rarely left the holler, and when he did, he carried with him a Bible so worn it barely held together. Yet, inside its margins, he had scribbled his own words, verses twisted into warnings that no outsider could interpret. The midwife would later tell her own daughter that she felt a chill just stepping into that cabin. The fire inside burned low, but the air reeked of iron and rot, as though something had already spoiled. The birth came swiftly. 2 children, identical twins. They were pale as wax, their skin almost translucent, with veins mapping beneath like rivers beneath ice. When they cried, the sound was not sharp and human but warbling, high-pitched, distorted, as if something in their throats was misaligned. The midwife shuddered. She had heard infants cry in every manner of pain and life, but never like this. These cries echoed against the wooden beams, carrying out into the holler and rolling down into the valley below. And those who heard them swore it was not the cry of children, but the keening of some wounded animal that had never belonged to this world. The mother lay pale, her face drenched in sweat. The father, however, did not weep with joy. Instead, he stared at the children with something that looked almost like triumph, as if these waxen twins were exactly what he had been waiting for. He whispered something under his breath, too low for the midwife to hear, but she caught one word: pure. Outside, the horses tied to the post screamed and tore at their reins. The dog beneath the porch howled and clawed at the door until its paws bled. Animals, it seemed, wanted nothing to do with the newborns. The midwife did her duty. She wrapped the children in cloth and handed them to their father. But as she reached for the door, she felt an overwhelming urge to leave not just the cabin but the holler itself, to put miles between herself and those twins. For she could not shake the feeling that they were not entirely human. Later that night, she told her husband she would never step foot in that house again. Whispers began before dawn. Neighbors spoke of the cries that echoed across the valley, of lanterns flickering though no wind stirred. Some said the children were cursed, born of sins that should have remained buried. Others muttered about the family's strange lineage. Marriages kept too close, branches of a family tree twisting back into itself. In those hills, superstition was currency, and these twins, it seemed, were already a debt no one wanted to owe. Records from the time, fragmented church logs, scraps of letters, and a single journal entry from a traveling preacher hint at the unease. One note reads simply, 2 babes born in the holler. Not right. The Lord's light does not reach them. Yet no baptism was ever recorded. No priest ever stepped foot inside that cabin. The twins were kept hidden, as though daylight itself might expose something the father could not bear the world to see. From that first night, strange occurrences multiplied. Chickens refused to lay eggs near the cabin. Wells soured, their water turning bitter. And one neighbor swore that when she walked past the house, she heard not the cries of infants, but something speaking, not in words she knew, but in syllables heavy with some older rhythm, a lullaby that chilled her to her bones. The holler was already a place of isolation, but with the twins' arrival, it became something more, a place avoided, a hollowed-out corner of Appalachia, where even hunters dared not tread. Those who lived closest spoke in lowered voices, claiming the mountain itself had birthed them, that the ground beneath that cabin was older, darker, and hungrier than anyone had known. And in those whispers lay the seed of a story that would haunt generations. What then Could these newborns possibly become, in a land already steeped in superstition, already half convinced that the mountains themselves demanded their due? One question still lingers. Were the twins the result of human choices, or had something older, something buried deep in the bones of the earth, chosen them? And before we continue, don't forget to subscribe. The next part is even more terrifying. By the age of 6, something about the twins was undeniable. Neighbors whispered it first in kitchens, then in churchyards, and finally in fearful murmurs as they packed up their wagons and fled the holler. The twins, pale, waxen, uncanny, had not grown like other children, their limbs elongated. Yes, their faces stretched in strange proportions, but the change was grotesque rather than natural. It was as if some invisible hand had pulled at them unevenly, shaping them into something neither child nor man. One farmer's wife, who had once gifted the family a basket of bread, claimed that when she returned a year later, the boys looked exactly the same height, same skin tone, same wide, glassy eyes. It was like time hadn't touched them, she wrote in her diary. Like they had been dipped in wax and set upon the shelf. Others echoed the sentiment. Their voices never deepened, their laughter never mellowed. Instead, they spoke with a high, reedy pitch, a sound so unsettling that some neighbors swore it echoed long after the boys were gone from earshot. A traveling preacher who braved the holler described them as frozen between forms, neither child nor man, neither innocent nor damned. He left before nightfall, never to return. But perhaps most chilling of all was the way the record of their existence seemed to dissolve. No official birth certificate was ever logged. No baptism entry appeared in the county's books. A census taker in 1870 was said to have listed the cabin and family, only for the paper to vanish weeks later. One clerk swore he had written the names with his own hand, but when he returned to check, the ink was gone, not smudged, not crossed out, simply erased as though it had never been put to paper. This was not merely rumor. Surviving fragments of courthouse ledgers bear strange scars, torn pages, whole sections blackened by candle flame. In one account, the county registrar recorded in frustration, "Someone does not want them written." Whether the culprit was the father, the church, or something else entirely, no one could say. Meanwhile, families who lived near the holler began abandoning their farms. Some cited failing crops, though their soil had been fertile for years. Others spoke of livestock vanishing overnight, of milk souring in the pail before it reached the table. But most gave simpler reasons: unnatural sounds at night, whispers that drifted across the fields, footsteps that circled the house though no one stood outside. One man, a Civil War veteran hardened by bloodshed, confessed that he woke each night to the feeling of eyes staring at him through the window. The first time he rushed out with his rifle, he found only darkness. The second time, he swore he saw two shapes at the tree line, small, thin, unmoving. When he fired, the shapes did not flinch. By morning, his fields were empty, every chicken gone, their feathers scattered across the ground like snow. Within a week, he was gone too, leaving his homestead to rot. For those who stayed longer, the sightings grew bolder. Some claimed the twins wandered the woods after midnight, their pale figures glimpsed beneath the moonlight, their childlike voices singing in tones that carried for miles. But no one could ever follow the sound. It seemed to move, always just ahead, always luring the listener deeper into the dark. What unsettled people most was not merely what they saw, but what they felt. The twins' presence was described as oppressive, like the air itself thickened when they drew near. A young girl recalled walking past the cabin with her mother. Though she saw nothing, she swore the trees bent inward, their branches curling toward the roof, as if to shield the world from what was inside. The mother, pale and trembling, urged her daughter never to return. Even folklore began to twist. Local lullabies were altered, turning into warnings. Don't go into the holler, don't follow the sound. The children who never change are waiting. Stories spread of families cursed simply for crossing their path. Whether born of superstition or real encounters, the result was the same: isolation. By the end of the decade, much of the holler was abandoned, left to silence, decay, and the strange, perpetual cries that carried on the wind. But if the outside world sought to erase the twins, the father seemed intent on the opposite. Witnesses reported seeing him scrawling markings into the trees, circles intersected by jagged lines, symbols no one recognized. Some claimed these carvings matched those later found in abandoned churches farther down the valley, places where strange sects once gathered. Whether the father was preserving the boys' presence or binding them to the land, none could agree. What is certain is that the holler became a wound, a place neighbors avoided, a place even maps seemed reluctant to mark. One chilling entry from a widow who fled in 1869 lingers in the county archives. They look at you and you feel as though you've been weighed and found lacking. Their eyes are old, too old. I cannot bear it. I hear them even now, laughing in that thin, high way, and I know if I stay, they will come for me next. The twins remained in that cabin, unchanged, unacknowledged, unrecorded, while the rest of the world marched forward, while war raged and peace followed, while railroads carved their way through mountains. The holler seemed frozen, like time itself bent around those boys, refusing to let them go. And so the question grew louder. Were the twins a grotesque result of bloodlines too tightly wound, or something far darker, something that fed not on flesh, but on time itself? What the community did not yet realize was that the twins' strangeness was only beginning to reveal itself, and the next chapter of their lives would demand sacrifices far more chilling than abandoned farms. By 1869, whispers in the holler had already driven most families away. The cabins left behind stood empty, roofs sagging under moss and rot, their fields swallowed back into the wilderness. Yet for the few who remained, life took on a darker rhythm. Livestock, the heartbeat of survival in Appalachia, began to die in ways no one could explain. The first report came in spring. A farmer rose before dawn, lantern in hand, and found one of his cows sprawled lifeless in the field. At first he thought it a wolf attack. Wolves were common, and they killed with brutality. But this carcass bore no torn flesh, no ripped hide. Instead, the body lay untouched, save for 2 small punctures along the neck. The ground was soaked, but not with gore, with absence. The blood was gone, drained so completely that the earth beneath the cow was dry. He buried the animal quietly, fearing ridicule. But weeks later, another cow was found. Then another. By midsummer, the holler carried a new dread: cattle drained of blood, their bodies intact, their eyes glazed white as if frozen mid-panic. Some whispered the devil had come to Appalachia. Others said the land itself had turned against them. But no one spoke too loudly, for by then everyone knew where the suspicion would fall. The twins. Witness accounts began to surface, hesitant at first, then heavy with fear. One farmer swore he had risen in the night, hearing the lowing of his herd. When he crept into the pasture, he saw them. The twins, crouched low over the body of a fallen cow. The lantern light caught their faces slick with red, their mouths moving as if feeding, though their teeth left no bite marks. He froze, unable to cry out, unable to move, as both heads turned in unison, their eyes, pale and glowing, fixed on him. He swore later that they smiled, not like children, but like predators caught mid-feast. That farmer went to church the following Sunday. Against the urging of his wife, he stood before the congregation and told what he had seen. He warned them, begged them to act, to drive the family out before the land itself withered. But 3 days later, he vanished. His house stood open, his tools left mid-use in the field. His wife claimed she woke to footsteps circling the house, soft, measured, deliberate. When she dared to look, no one stood there. By dawn, Her husband was gone, and he was never seen again. It was then that the sheriff rode into the holler. A man hardened by frontier justice, he carried with him the expectation of answers. He questioned the wife, inspected the fields, even braved the cabin where the twins lived, but his notes, preserved in fragments, reveal little beyond unease. One entry, smudged and nearly illegible, survives in the county archive. They looked at me with the same face, and I felt I was staring into something that should not be. He left the holler within the week, filing no charges, issuing no reports. The disappearance of the farmer went unsolved. His land, like so many others, grew wild. Still, the cattle deaths continued. Farmers desperate to protect their herds built higher fences, lit fires through the night, set out traps meant for wolves. None of it worked. Animals were found drained in locked barns, their doors still bolted from within. One man swore he had barred his stable and slept in front of the door with a rifle, only to wake at dawn to silence. Inside, his horses lay collapsed, their bodies pale and bloodless, as though some unseen hand had passed through wood and iron alike. The fear was not confined to livestock. Mothers kept their children indoors. Neighbors who had once whispered now locked their doors and spoke no more. When smoke rose from the cabin in the holler, they turned away, unwilling to admit that life still stirred there, that the twins were still watching, still waiting. Folklore again rose to fill the void. Some claimed the boys were not of human lineage at all, but changeling creatures left by something ancient in place of true sons. Others said the father had bargained with the mountain, trading the lives of neighbors for the survival of his cursed bloodline. Whatever the explanation, one thing was clear: where the twins walked, life withered. A widow passing through the holler on her way west recorded in her journal that she saw the twins in a field at dusk. They stood over a cow's carcass, motionless, their heads cocked at an unnatural angle. She hurried on, clutching her Bible, but swore she heard their high, childlike voices drift after her. "We are still hungry." Whether hallucination, fear, or truth, it was enough. She would later write, "The holler is unfit for God tests creatures. It belongs to them now." The story of the drained cattle spread beyond the valley. In nearby towns, whispers of blood drinkers attached themselves to the family name. Preachers used the tale as a warning against sin, while skeptics laughed it off as superstition. But those who had stood in the holler, those who had seen the pale faces glimmering at the edge of lamplight, knew better. And so the land emptied further. Farms collapsed into ruin. The holler grew silent, save for the wind and the distant, unearthly cries that bled from the trees. The twins remained, ageless, unchanged, untouched by time. Their presence marked only by the hollered bodies of animals and the hollered lives of those who crossed their path. The world outside might have forgotten them, but inside the holler, the legend of the missing cattle was only the beginning. The twins' hunger was growing, and soon it would not be livestock that vanished. By 1872, the holler had emptied into silence. Families were gone, their farms surrendered to weeds and decay. The only ones who remained were the father, the twins, and the whispers that traveled beyond the ridges. It was those whispers that drew the attention of a physician from Lexington, Kentucky. A man of science, trained in reason rather than folklore. He came not seeking salvation, but study. His name was Dr. Alistair McKenna. In his journals, preserved in fragments and smudged with age, he described his journey as an attempt to dispel superstition. "Appalachia is rife with ignorance," he wrote, "and I will show that the devil children are but victims of deformity and fear." But what he found and what his notes reveal tells a far darker story. The doctor's first encounter with the twins was marked by unease. He entered the cabin expecting malnourished children, perhaps suffering from the effects of inbreeding. Instead, he was greeted by figures that seemed suspended between states of being. "Their faces are stretched," he recorded, "yet their eyes are those of infants. Their voices remain childlike, though their stature is approaching manhood. They are trapped in some purgatory of growth, elongating without maturing. But it was their anatomy that chilled him most. He examined their limbs, noting bones fused where joints should be free, elbows that bent only halfway, knees that locked in unnatural stiffness. Yet the twins moved with unsettling speed, darting across the cabin with jerks and lurches that defied their malformed structure. "They are not bound by the mechanics of ordinary flesh," he wrote. "They are guided by something else." Their blood, too, defied reason. When he pricked a vein, it flowed sluggishly, thicker than any he had seen, more tar than life blood. The color was darker, nearly black, and it clotted almost instantly upon exposure to air. "It is as though the substance within them is not meant to sustain man," he scribbled, "but to sustain something older." Strangest of all was their relation to time. Villagers had long reported that the boys never slept, and the doctor confirmed this. For the 3 nights he remained in the holler, he never once saw them close their eyes. By day they wandered the woods, pale shapes slipping through the trees. By night they prowled the ridges, their pale skin catching moonlight until they gleamed like phantoms. The doctor marveled at their endurance, though his awe soon turned to unease. "Rest is the boundary between sanity and madness," he wrote. "To live without it is to be unmoored from humanity. And yet these children, if they are children, seem sustained by something beyond nature." The villagers had long watched them from afar, fearful of their ceaseless wandering. Some claimed the twins stood outside homes in the darkest hours, staring through windows, their reflections pale against the glass. Others swore they heard the sound of 2 voices humming in perfect unison, weaving through the night air like a dirge. One widow whispered to the doctor that she had seen them in the cemetery, moving among the graves as if counting them. She never returned after their gaze fell on her. Dr. McKenna intended to publish his findings. His notes reveal a man torn between horror and scientific ambition. "This discovery could rewrite what we know of heredity," he proclaimed in one entry, "or prove what the Church has long feared, that man is not alone in his form." His language oscillates between clinical detachment and something near hysteria, as though even in the act of writing, he felt the presence of the twins pressing upon him. But then the entries falter. His writing grows disjointed, his script erratic. He begins to describe not merely observation, but encounter. One-page notes. "They follow me. Their eyes do not blink. Their mouths curve, though I cannot call it a smile." Another. "The woods are alive with their voices. They call my name, though I never told it to them." The final entry chills more than any diagnosis. "Tonight they came to me. Their mouths were not meant for prayer." The journal ends there. The doctor was never seen again. His horse was found days later at the edge of the holler, reins snapped, eyes wide with terror. His satchel was recovered years later, in an abandoned mill, the journal inside nearly ruined by mildew. The last pages, that final entry, were preserved only because they had been pressed between 2 scraps of oilcloth, as though someone had meant for them to survive. What happened that night remains speculation. Some claim the twins silenced him to preserve their secret. Others believe the father, desperate to protect his bloodline, cast the man into the forest. Yet there are whispers of a third possibility, that the twins themselves demanded his silence, not with violence but with something far worse, an invitation. For those who later read his journal, one line stands out: "Their mouths were not meant for prayer." What did he see? What shape did those mouths take when they came to him in the dark? And what words or sounds did they utter that drove him to end his account in terror? The holler would not forget the doctor's visit, and as the years passed, it became clear that his notes were not merely the ramblings of a frightened man. For the twins' hunger was growing, and soon it would turn from livestock and physicians to something far more chilling. By the year 1875, the holler had grown quiet, not in the way of peaceful silence, but in the way of a graveyard after nightfall, where the stillness itself felt heavy, watchful, and wrong. The once lively Appalachian Valley, with its cabins tucked along the ridgeline and its farms scattered across the low ground, had become a place people whispered about but dared not linger in. The smoke that once rose from chimneys had thinned to nothing. The sound of children's laughter, once echoing through the trees, had been replaced by the unsettling absence of life itself. What the records show is stark. In a span of months, families who had lived for generations in that valley vanished without trace. Their absence was not explained by floods, not by famine, nor by migration westward as so many others chose. These families were there one night, their lamps glowing in the windows, and by morning the doors swung open, food sat rotting on the table, and the hearth fire had burned itself out. Survivors, few as they were, spoke of a phenomenon that chilled even hardened frontiersmen: knocking, always knocking. It would come in the dead of night, long after the moon had risen and the whippoorwills had gone quiet. A sudden rap on the doorframe, steady and deliberate, as though someone stood on the threshold with purpose. The knocking never came once or twice, always 3 times, a hollow rhythm, like a signal. When the brave or foolish opened their doors, there was nothing there. Just the dark expanse of the trees, the endless black of the mountains beyond. Yet the families who heard the knocking rarely lasted long. Within days, sometimes hours, someone would go missing. A child plucked from their bed with no sound, no struggle, no broken window or splintered door. A mother found wandering outside, barefoot in the frost, her mind shattered, unable to recall how she had gotten there or why her infant's cradle now lay empty. The census of 1875 shows the carnage in ink and paper, dozens of names scratched through with the chilling annotation, "Missing, presumed dead." Entire households marked in red, vanishing in sequence like candles being snuffed out one by one. The stories that leaked out, and there were only a few, for most witnesses disappeared themselves, all carried the same image, the same nightmare. People swore they had seen them at the edge of the tree line, 2 figures standing side by side, motionless as if carved from the same stone, identical, and yet wrong. The same faces, the same pale hair, the same sunken, piercing eyes. They never moved. They never spoke. They only watched. And when they disappeared back into the shadows of the mountain, someone was always gone by dawn. Whispers spread that the twins had changed, that they had grown stronger, their hunger no longer sated by the livestock that had first gone missing years earlier. Now they fed on people. The cattle mutilations, the blood-drained sheep, had all been warnings ignored, and now the price was being paid in flesh and blood. One woman who fled with her surviving son to relatives in Kentucky gave a testimony that survives in fragments. She claimed her husband heard the knocking late one night, just before Christmas. He had risen from bed, taken his lantern, and opened the door. She heard nothing but silence, save for his whispered words, "They're out there." When she ran to the doorway, he was gone. The lantern lay shattered in the snow, its oil still burning, but no footprints led away from the cabin. Her son later told neighbors he saw 2 figures at the tree line, their faces pale and unblinking, their bodies too still to be human. The mountains kept their secrets. The holler swallowed its people whole. Yet rumors slipped through, carried by the last desperate families who abandoned their land in the hope of saving themselves. They spoke of how the air grew heavier at night, how the woods seemed to hum with a presence unseen, how animals no longer came near the valley at all. Even the birds, they said, had stopped singing. But perhaps most chilling of all were the tales that emerged from those who dared to remain behind just long enough to glimpse what others had only whispered about. They claimed the twins no longer looked entirely human, their limbs too long, their movements too unnatural when finally glimpsed in motion, that their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, reflecting lantern light like the eyes of wolves. Yet the official records tell a different kind of story, not one of folklore, but of absence, of names erased, households collapsed, and an entire community reduced to ink scratches in a ledger. The valley was empty by the late 1870s, a ghost hollow abandoned to time. Travelers avoided the place altogether. Roads grew over with weeds, cabins rotted where they stood, and the forest crept back to reclaim what had once been cleared. And still the knocking was whispered of. Even in towns far from the valley, people claimed to hear it in their dreams. 3 raps on the door. A pause. Silence. As if the twins, wherever they were, had not finished their work. The vanishing villagers became another Appalachian mystery, one folded into local superstition and half-forgotten tales. But those who studied the records, the census men, the ministers, the historians who came later, saw a pattern that could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. Too many gone in too little time. Too many identical sightings of 2 identical figures. Too many doors left open in the night, fires left burning in the hearth, meals left half-eaten on the table. The land itself bore scars. When surveyors finally passed through decades later, they reported finding cabins abandoned in a state that suggested no one had ever left willingly. Coats still hung by doors, tools still resting on workbenches, furniture still upright, untouched. It was as though the occupants had stepped outside for only a moment, never to return. And through it all, the question endured, whispered by those who dared to speak of it, ignored by those who feared the answer. Were the twins hunting the people of the valley, or was the valley itself hunting through them? The county courthouse in Appalachia is not a place of grandeur. It sits low against the hills, its wooden beams sagging under the weight of a century and a half of rain, rot, and silence. Dust gathers in corners that no broom has touched in decades, and in the record office, the air tastes of mildew and disuse. It was here, among brittle papers and fading ink, that the first traces of the twins' family tree were uncovered. On its surface, the ledger seemed ordinary enough, neat columns of names, dates, and unions that stitched the Appalachian families together like a quilt. But the closer one looked, the more tangled the stitching became. The book revealed marriages that were not marriages at all, but arrangements between blood, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, sister to brother, a pattern of forbidden bonds concealed under euphemisms. Where one might expect to see 2 different surnames, often only one appeared, the same name repeated, generation after generation, as though the family tree was curling inward instead of branching outward. The handwriting grew uneven with each passing decade, as though the clerks themselves grew uncomfortable recording what they could not stop. Some entries were scratched out hastily, but the faint impressions of what had once been written remained legible when held against the light. Twin union. Same line. Words no public document should ever have carried. At first it was dismissed as an error of record-keeping, a quirk of an underfunded rural clerk's office, but when cross-checked with church baptism records and burial logs, the truth refused to stay hidden. The names matched too often. Children were born of unions never spoken of in polite company. Birth dates overlapped in ways impossible without incestuous overlap. Whole generations seemed to have been produced not by neighbors, not by distant kin, but by one closed circle feeding upon itself. And in the middle of it all, always without fail, the line of the twins. The record showed that they were not an anomaly, but the culmination of something long in motion. A purity experiment, perhaps, or simply the consequence of an isolated community that had sealed itself off from the outside world. Yet there was an intentionality to the way the names repeated, as though the family had not merely tolerated it but believed in it. Whispers among older townsfolk spoke of a covenant, an unholy pact sealed generations before the twins' birth. To keep the land, to keep their harvest, to keep something alive that could not survive outside their bloodline. Marriage records became more than bureaucratic ink. They became evidence of a ritual sustained across time. One entry stood out more than the rest, dated 1841 in faded brown ink that had bled into the page. It listed no bride, no groom, only a chilling phrase, "Flesh binds to flesh." Unlike the other entries, this one bore no clerk's signature, as though whoever wrote it did not want their name tied to the act, and beneath it, a symbol, a crude, looping mark resembling two interlocked circles. When compared to carvings found later in the family's abandoned cabin, the symbol was identical. It was not a flourish, it was a seal. Historians who examined the ledger grew divided. Some argued it was evidence of a forgotten Appalachian cult, disguising ritualistic pairings under the guise of matrimony. Others believed it was simply a community so desperate for survival in the isolated mountains that the rules of blood and kinship broke down. But none could explain the sheer persistence of the practice. Over 70 years, the same names circled back upon themselves. By the time the twins were born in 1862, their genetic inheritance was less a tree than a noose, a tightening loop from which no child could escape. The abnormalities that followed were not accidents. They were inevitabilities. And yet, the ledger did more than reveal bloodlines. It hinted at concealment. Pages had been torn out, entire decades erased as though someone had tried to cauterize a wound. A later hand had written in replacements, but they were crude, inconsistent, and often contradicted surviving church records. Whatever was removed was not meant to be seen. Archivists who handled the book reported an unease that could not be explained by mildew or dim candlelight. One remarked that the ink bled fresh under his fingertips, as though the record resisted being handled. Another swore that when she closed the book, she heard the faint creak of children laughing, though the courthouse stood empty. Skeptics dismissed such accounts as folklore, but the marriage records remained undeniable in their grotesque simplicity. Names repeated, bonds forbidden, children born with features the outside world could not classify. The most chilling part was not the past, but the implication of continuity. The last entries in the book were dated decades after the twins' birth, well into the 1880s, long after one might have expected the practice to dissolve under modern law and migration. Yet the entries persisted, each with the same recycled names, the same looping seal. Even as the outside world modernized, the family's private covenant continued in silence. And then suddenly, nothing. The book stopped. No more names, no more dates. The hand that wrote the final entry seemed hurried, jagged, and unfinished. It read only, "The line is complete." Complete with what? With whom? No one knows. The courthouse staff claimed the family had moved, assimilated, or vanished into the hills, but local rumor insists otherwise. They say the family never ended, only went deeper underground. That the blood pact still breathes in forgotten cabins, where no census taker dares to knock. The forbidden marriage records are more than history. They are a confession written in ink, one the land itself seems unwilling to let fade. And when genealogists and historians attempt to speak of it, they lower their voices, as though afraid that speaking the names aloud might awaken something buried in the hills. Because in Appalachia, family is not always heritage. Sometimes it is a curse. By the winter of 1878, the mountain community had reached its breaking point. For more than a decade, the twins' presence had been an open wound on the land, unspoken, festering, but never forgotten. Livestock vanished in the night. Hunters returned from the woods pale and trembling, swearing they had glimpsed shapes watching from the tree line. Children spoke in whispers of voices carried on the wind, of laughter that didn't belong to any living soul. It was not a sudden decision, but rather a slow accumulation of dread that finally gave way to resolve. One by one, the families of the Hollow agreed the curse had to end. And if fire was the only language evil understood, then fire they would speak. On a night when the snow fell thick and heavy, muffling even the crunch of boots, a band of men and women gathered with torches in hand. Their faces were shadowed, not just by the flames, but by the guilt of what they were about to do. Few of them had ever taken a life. None would admit aloud that they were preparing to kill. not people, at least, but something they no longer considered human. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, its roof sagging under the weight of snow, its windows glowing faintly from the fire within. The neighbors approached in silence, their breaths forming clouds that drifted upward like the smoke soon to come. And then someone gasped. There, framed in the doorway, stood the twins. Their shapes were unmistakable, tall and thin, shoulder to shoulder as they had always been since birth. The firelight from within threw their faces into relief, and though the distance was great, the villagers swore they could see smiles curling across their lips, smiles that were not of fear, nor of defiance, but of something colder, something that suggested they already knew how this night would end. The torches were cast. Flames leapt to the dry wood, eager and greedy, devouring the walls with a crackling roar. The villagers stepped back, shielding their faces from the heat, but not one broke formation. They watched as the fire spread, climbing the logs like hands clawing skyward. From within came no screams, no cries for mercy. Only silence, silence punctuated by the occasional groan of burning timber. Some swore the twins did not move at all, that they remained standing in the doorway until the smoke consumed them, their smiles fixed in place as though mocking the crowd outside. Hours passed before the cabin collapsed into itself, reduced to glowing embers and the hiss of snow melting against heat. Only then did the neighbors dare to approach, stepping cautiously into the ruin. What they found froze them colder than the night air. There were no bodies, no bone, no ash, not a trace of human remains. Instead, the stone foundation bore deep gouges, as though some beast had torn at it with claws. The marks cut so far into the rock that they seemed impossible to have been made by hand or tool. The air within the ruins was heavy, acrid with smoke, but beneath it lingered something else, a coppery tang, faint but unmistakable. Panic rippled through the group. Some insisted the twins had escaped into the woods, untouched by flame. Others whispered a darker possibility that the fire had never been meant to kill them, because nothing mortal could. Instead, it had only served to release them, to unshackle whatever bound them to the cabin. The land was abandoned soon after. No one dared to rebuild. The hollow became a dead space on the map, a scar where trees grew twisted and stunted, where animals refused to graze. Travelers who strayed too close reported unease, a sense of being watched, as if the snow itself concealed eyes beneath its surface. For years the ruin stood silent, blackened stones buried under drifts of white. The claw marks remained untouched by weather, as though carved into the very memory of the land. And whenever storms swept through the mountains, neighbors swore the wind carried with it laughter, thin, high-pitched and doubled, echoing as though from two mouths speaking as one. The burning of the cabin was meant to bring closure, but instead, it cemented the legend. The people of Appalachia did not speak of it openly. They passed it down in warnings, in hushed stories told by firelight. Parents forbade their children from straying near the ruins, not for fear of what might be found, but for fear of what might follow them back. In the years that followed, the hollow became a marker on the land, a place avoided, feared and left to rot. Yet beneath the ashes, in the silence of stone and soil, something endured, something that fire could not touch, and that time would not erase. The curse, it seemed, had not been ended. It had merely been given room to grow, and the question that lingered, unanswered, was the same one whispered that night as the villagers fled into the snow. If the fire did not consume the twins, then what did? By 1885, most of Appalachia had begun to bury the story of the inbred twins beneath silence and superstition. The fire that consumed their family homestead in the mid-1870s was spoken of only in whispers, treated as an ending. A final chapter in a tale too disturbing to recount. But Appalachia has always been a place where endings rarely stay buried. It began, as most resurrections of folklore do, with a sighting, a group of hunters, Hardened men who knew the mountains better than they knew their own wives returned from a midnight trip, pale and shaken. They told of moving through a thicket near the old homestead's ashes, lanterns swaying against the trees, when two figures stepped from the dark. Children. At first, that was the only word they could use, children. Their small frames, their hair hanging limp against sickly white skin, their bare feet pressing silently into the snow-covered soil. But as the hunter's lantern light caught the figures full on, every man froze. The faces were wrong. The features were unchanged, frozen in time. It had been nearly a decade since the fire, yet the twins appeared no older than the night they were last seen, still no more than 10 years old, still staring with that vacant corpse-like emptiness. What made the hunters flee was not movement, but stillness. The twins did not blink. They did not speak. They did not even breathe in a way the men could hear. Their eyes caught the lamplight, like an animal's, glowing back with a dull, silvery reflection. And when one hunter swore he saw their lips part, there was no sound, only the faint smell of charred wood drifting into the clearing. The men bolted. None dared fire a rifle. None dared curse aloud. It was as though to acknowledge the thing before them, as human would invite something worse. They ran, branches tearing at their coats, until the lanterns burned low. By morning the story was out. The twins had returned. Rumor in Appalachia has a way of spreading like wildfire, feeding not on truth but on fear. Within days the tale reached neighboring towns. Some scoffed, others whispered prayers. But the ones who had lived through the fire, the ones who had seen the twins in their earliest years, knew there was no mistaking those pale, blood-thin faces. For some the explanation was simple. They had not perished in the fire. Somehow, impossibly, they had endured, living in the wilderness like feral things. Yet the timeline didn't match. If they had lived, they should have grown. They should have changed. Instead, they remained trapped in the bodies of children, suspended in some unnatural state that mocked the very idea of time. Others turned to darker reasoning. The fire, they said, had not killed the twins. It had stripped them, burned away what little humanity was left in them, leaving only raw instinct, hunger, and the twisted resilience of their cursed bloodline. They were no longer children at all, but revenants, something between human and beast, doomed to stalk the woods forever. The accounts did not stop with the hunters. Over the following months, more encounters were whispered about in cabins and at church steps. A farmer swore he saw two small figures crouching in his cornfield at dusk, their faces pale against the stalks, their eyes fixed on him until he turned away. A trapper claimed he found strange, child-sized prints by the riverbank in midwinter, bare feet pressed into ice, yet no sign of frostbite, no trail leading forward or back. Even livestock began to disappear. Cows bled dry in the night. Chickens slaughtered without being eaten, their bodies arranged in crude, almost ritualistic patterns. Families who dared follow the trails reported the same thing, the tracks of children stopping suddenly as though swallowed by the earth itself. By then, whispers gave way to dread. The community came to believe the fire had not destroyed the curse of the bloodline, it had unleashed it. One night, a preacher gathered his congregation by lamplight. He spoke of sin, of God's wrath, of how certain bloodlines were never meant to flourish. His voice trembled as he recounted the hunter's tale, insisting that what they had seen were not children at all, but omens, walking proof that the devil himself had marked this land. The twins, he said, were not alive in any way mortals could comprehend. They were echoes, lingering spirits wearing the skin of children, waiting for anyone foolish enough to stray too far into the mountains. Yet the preacher's words brought no comfort. If anything, they gave form to a fear that had already rooted in every household, the belief that the twins were eternal, that no bullet, no fire, no prayer could end them. A generation later, some would claim the sightings faded, that the twins retreated deeper into the wilderness and became more myth than memory. But for those who lived through the winter of 1885, the return of the twins was undeniable. They were seen, they were remembered, and the mountains once more seemed alive with their presence. For when the wind howled through the pines, it sometimes carried with it the faintest sound, a child's laughter, cracked and broken, echoing far too close to the ruins of the burned homestead. Not quite human, not quite gone. Something caught between. That year, Appalachia learned a chilling truth. You cannot bury what was never meant to die. The fire was not the end. It was only the beginning. By the end of the 19th century, the legends of the inbred twins had already taken firm root in Appalachian folklore. Whispers traveled beyond the hollers and logging camps, carried by traveling preachers, wandering merchants, and the occasional newspaperman desperate for a story that would sell. But it wasn't just locals who took interest. By 1890, medicine and science were accelerating rapidly, and the frontier between superstition and research was thinning. A group of men believed they could pierce that veil, prove what lay behind the tales of the things born wrong, and return with their names forever etched into medical history. They would never return at all. The expedition consisted of 5 men, 3 physicians from a small college in Virginia, a naturalist with ties to the Smithsonian, and a hired guide who knew the mountains. Their journals, at least those recovered later, described their arrival with the arrogance typical of outsiders. They wrote of bringing lanterns, surgical instruments, measuring devices, and a camera with newly developed dry plates. They were certain they would uncover a genetic anomaly, some long-hidden inbred family line that science could categorize. What they failed to consider was that the people of the holler had been warning outsiders for decades, not out of ignorance, but out of fear. On the 3rd day of their journey, they set up camp near a river bend, where, according to locals, strange footprints had been sighted after heavy rains. The naturalist sketched impressions in his notebook, elongated, malformed, almost symmetrical but wrong, as though 2 sets of toes grew from the same foot. At night, the party reported hearing movement in the tree line. Branches broke, and stones tumbled down the ridges, but when they shined their lanterns, nothing stirred. The guide grew nervous, urging them to keep their fire large, but the doctors scoffed. They noted that the mountaineers' hysteria has colored even our man of the woods. The recovered journals describe a growing unease. The expedition would hear rustling behind them, but when they turned, the sound would leap ahead, as though whatever followed could move faster than they could comprehend. By the 5th night, their entries turned frantic. One passage noted, "We glimpsed them," or it, "God help us. I cannot describe it plainly." Shapes moving as if bound together, jerking like marionettes, yet silent as the grave. They watched, not fleeing as animals would, but swaying, waiting. From this point, the writing becomes increasingly erratic. Diagrams of skeletal structures fill the margins, spines doubled over, limbs fused and split again, torsos that seem to share one ribcage. The physicians had come seeking a specimen of malformed biology, but what they described was something that broke the very notion of classification. They come as one, but they are not two. The final journal entry read, written in a trembling hand across a blood-stained page. Beneath the sentence, a smear, as though the pen had been dragged away mid-word. Locals later discovered the abandoned camp deep within a cave system, miles from where the expedition was last seen. The medical equipment was scattered, their camera shattered against the stone. Lanterns lay cold, and their bedrolls were slashed open, as though torn from within. Of the 5 men, not a single body was ever recovered. Only their papers remained, stuffed hastily into a satchel, as though someone had tried to save the record even as doom closed in. What unsettled the search party most were the tracks leading into the cave. They were wide, dragged, as if something heavy had been pulled inside. Yet alongside them ran lighter prints, bare, human-like, but paired too closely, as though one creature pressed 2 feet into the earth at once. Inside, the walls were marked with deep scratches, spiraling upward into the darkness of the chamber's ceiling. No one was brave enough to go deeper than the abandoned supplies. The cave was resealed with stone and earth. Older men muttered it had been sealed once before, and now had to be sealed again. Over the years, whispers spread of what happened to the expedition. Some claimed the twins had claimed new blood, taking the doctors into their brood. Others said the cave itself was cursed, a womb where the impossible lingered, feeding on whoever trespassed. Yet every retelling came back to that same final line found in the blood-streaked journal: "They come as one, but they are not two." It is a phrase that resists understanding. To scientists, it reads like a puzzle of physiology, a statement of abnormal fusion or mutation. To locals, however, it confirmed what they had always known, that the twins were not human in the way humans understood. They were something else. A singular entity split across mirrored flesh, bound not by family but by something older, hungrier, and infinitely more patient. By the turn of the century, the story of the lost expedition had become a warning told in hushed tones around fires. Parents would point to the mountains and tell their children never follow the ridges into the holler, never go where the caves breathe cold. For beyond the rocks and trees something still walked, silent, waiting, not two, not one, but both. By the dawn of the 20th century, the tale of the Appalachian twins had passed from living memory into legend. What was once whispered in barns and traded as hushed warnings around church fires became something darker, folklore that refused to die. Parents cautioned children against wandering too far into the woods, not because of bears or wolves, but because of voices. High, brittle, and childlike. Laughter that seemed to come from nowhere or everywhere at once. The kind of sound that could draw you deeper until you no longer knew the way back. At first, these warnings were dismissed as the superstitions of mountain folk, but then came the discovery: a structure hidden so deep within the mountains that only the most determined hunters and wanderers could have stumbled upon it. It was not a cabin, not a church, not even the ruins of an old homestead. It was a crypt. The structure sat half buried in the earth, as though the mountain itself had tried to swallow it whole. Its stone facade was blackened with moss, its edges worn smooth by decades, perhaps centuries of weather. Thick iron chains crisscrossed the heavy doors, rusted but still intact, as if someone had wanted not just to bury what was inside, but to bind it shut. Above the entrance was a carving so weathered it nearly blended into the stone, but those who pressed close could still make out the words etched by a careful, terrified hand: "Do not unbind them. They will not rest." The message was not scripture. It was not a prayer. It was a warning. When word of the crypt spread, scholars and amateur historians flocked to Appalachia, eager to examine what some called the region's greatest archaeological discovery. But the locals did not share their excitement. They refused to guide outsiders to the site. They refused to even speak of it. And when pressed, they only offered a single chilling explanation: those chains weren't meant to keep anything out. They were meant to keep something in. Accounts vary on who first dared to break the seal. Some say it was a traveling naturalist. Others claim it was a group of treasure hunters. Whoever it was, they managed to pry the rusted iron aside, if only partially, and peer into the tomb. Inside was darkness, a corridor cut into the rock, its air thick and stale, smelling faintly of rot even after all those years. The explorers claimed to see carvings on the walls, though none agreed on what they depicted. Some swore they were crude portraits of children with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. Others insisted they were not depictions at all, but sigils, marks of some faith not born of scripture, but of fear. And deeper still, they said, lay a pair of sarcophagi, identical in shape, identical in size. Not coffins, but stone vessels, sealed tight. And though the explorers never broke them open, they reported something strange: the sound of scratching, faint, but unmistakable. Nails against stone. Of course, skeptics dismiss these accounts as hysteria, born of superstition and the oppressive atmosphere of the crypt. They point out that fear can conjure illusions, that echoes in such a chamber could play tricks on the ears. But others believe the explorers had stumbled upon the final resting place of the twins, entombed not by choice, but by desperation. The official record remains frustratingly thin. No artifacts from the crypt were ever catalogued, no photographs of the sarcophagi ever surfaced. The explorers, if they truly existed, left behind nothing but stories that spread like wildfire through the towns and valleys, and in their wake, the locals took action. The chains, broken and scattered by those who entered, were reforged, the doors resealed, the site abandoned to the forest once more. And by the 1920s, all talk of the crypt had been swallowed by silence. Those who asked about it were met with blank stares or the quiet shaking of heads. But legends, like chains, can only hold so long. Hikers in the mid-century began reporting strange occurrences in the region where the crypt was said to lie. Some claimed to hear the laughter, always laughter, echoing faintly among the trees, rising and falling with the wind. Others told of finding small handprints in the mud, far from any homestead, pressed deep as though left by something heavy, unnatural. A few even reported glimpses, two small figures darting between the trees, always just out of sight. In every account, the figures were described the same, childlike in stature, but wrong. Their movements too fast, their proportions too distorted. Their eyes, when seen, were said to glint like wet glass in the dark. By the late 20th century, the site of the crypt was all but lost. Maps failed to agree on its location, and those who searched for it came back empty-handed, or not at all. Some suggested the mountain itself had shifted, swallowing the entrance forever. Others whispered that the crypt did not want to be found, that it moved, like a wound in the earth, appearing only to those it chose. What remains is the warning, carved in stone, etched into memory, passed down in whispers even now. Do not unbind them, they will not rest. What waits in that crypt, if it still exists, is a question no one dares to answer. Were the twins merely children, malformed and cursed by nature? Were they something far older, something the villagers could not explain, but only fear? Or were they, as some dare to believe, not human at all? Whatever the truth, the mountains keep their secrets well. And when the wind howls through the trees, carrying that brittle, childlike laughter, those who hear it say the same thing. The crypt was never a tomb. It was a prison. And some prisons were never meant to be opened.